On a busy street in downtown Boston, a scene of shocking injustice was about to backfire when three patrol officers surrounded 93-year-old Rose Thompson as she walked home from her weekly grocery trip. They thought they were dealing with just another confused elderly woman. Their arrogant smirks turned to stone as she reached for her phone and dialed one number. What these officers didn't know was that Rose's grandson, Commander Jack Thompson, wasn't just any military man. He was one of the most lethal Navy SEALs in modern history. His classified operations had earned him a call sign that made even hardened warriors pause: the Arbitrator. Now, as her trembling voice reaches him at the Naval Special Warfare Command, he's about to remind these officers about the true meaning of justice and respect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn crept through the lace curtains of Rose Thompson's century-old Victorian home, casting delicate shadows across her meticulously organized kitchen. At 93, Rose moved with the deliberate grace of someone who refused to let age dictate her independence. Her weathered hands smoothed down her carefully pressed floral dress, the same one she'd worn every Thursday for the past decade, as she prepared for her weekly grocery run. The morning routine was sacred to Rose. She rose at precisely 6:15 a.m., the same time she'd awakened during her 40-year tenure as Boston Public Library's head librarian. The copper kettle, a wedding gift from 1952, whistled right on schedule, and she prepared her English breakfast tea in her late husband Robert's favorite china cup. Some called it old-fashioned. Rose called it honoring memories. The neighbors along Maple Street knew her schedule by heart. Young Tommy from next door would wave from his school bus stop, and Mrs. Chen from the corner flower shop always had a fresh daisy ready as Rose passed by. "You're our neighborhood's heartbeat, Mrs. Thompson," Mrs. Chen would say. And she wasn't wrong. Rose had lived on this street long enough to watch children grow into parents, and those parents become grandparents themselves. But lately, something had felt different in her beloved neighborhood. Rose noticed the increased police presence, the way certain officers would circle the block multiple times during her morning walks. She'd overheard whispers at the community center about aggressive police stops, particularly targeting the elderly. Her friend Eleanor had been questioned aggressively last week about suspicious behavior, which turned out to be nothing more than feeding pigeons in the park. Today's shopping list was clipped to her vintage leather handbag, written in the same precise penmanship she'd used to catalog thousands of books. Weekly shopping wasn't just about necessities. It was Rose's way of staying connected to her community. The young cashier at Morton's Grocery, Sarah, was studying library science, and their Thursday conversations about classic literature were the highlight of both their weeks. As Rose adjusted her pearl necklace, another treasured piece of Robert's memory, she caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. Her silver hair was perfectly set, her posture straight as ever. "You're only as old as you let yourself be," she'd always told her grandson Jack. Those words had special meaning between them, forged during the difficult years after he lost his parents, her son and daughter-in-law, in a car accident when he was just 12. Jack had lived with her then, and she'd watched him transform from a grieving boy into a man of extraordinary principle and strength. Now a Navy SEAL commander, he carried the same precision and dignity she'd instilled in him. Their weekly phone calls were sacred, though she knew better than to ask about his work. "Just stay sharp, Grandma," he'd say, "and never let anyone underestimate you." Rose tucked her emergency phone, a gift from Jack, into her handbag. It was a simple device with just one button, programmed to call him directly. "It's not that I don't trust your judgment, Grandma," he'd said when giving it to her, "but these days, it's better to have backup ready." She'd laughed then, but something in his eyes told her he was deadly serious. Stepping out into the crisp morning air, Rose noticed an unfamiliar patrol car crawling down her street. The officers inside watched her with an intensity that seemed excessive for a woman her age. But Rose Thompson hadn't survived 9 decades by being easily intimidated. She straightened her spine, gripped her handbag firmly, and set out for Morton's grocery, unaware that this Thursday would be dramatically different from all the others. Officers Mike Brennan, Steve Reynolds and Tom Davidson sat in their patrol car, nursing lukewarm coffee and bruised egos. The morning briefing had been particularly harsh. Their precinct was under pressure to boost arrest numbers, and their sergeant hadn't been subtle about the consequences of failing to deliver. Brennan, the senior officer with 15 years on the force, drummed his fingers against the steering wheel. "Third warning this month. Captain's riding us hard." At 43, his once promising career had stalled. The chip on his shoulder had grown heavier with each passed-over promotion, each younger officer moving up while he remained stuck in patrol. "It's all politics," Reynolds spat, crumpling his coffee cup. At 35, he was the squad's enforcer, known for making suspects compliant before they reached the station. His personnel file bulged with civilian complaints, all mysteriously dismissed or buried in bureaucratic limbo. They want numbers? We'll give them numbers. Davidson, the youngest at 28, shifted uncomfortably in the back seat. 6 months into the job, he was already learning the wrong lessons from his seniors. "Maybe we should focus on actual suspicious activity." His suggestion earned him cold stares from both partners. "Listen, rookie," Brennan turned in his seat. "Out here, it's about survival. You think the brass cares about actual suspicious activity? They want stats, clean arrests, no resistance, easy processing." He gestured toward the quiet streets. "Of their patrol zone. This neighborhood's perfect. Lots of elderly. They get confused, make mistakes. One slight deviation from normal behavior, and we've got probable cause." The strategy wasn't new. Over the past 3 months, they'd developed a pattern, targeting senior citizens who lived alone, making up charges that were hard to dispute. Disorderly conduct, suspicious behavior, failure to comply with police orders. The charges never stuck, but they didn't need to. Each arrest padded their statistics, and most victims were too intimidated or exhausted to file complaints. Their precinct's Internal Affairs Division had developed selective blindness to these incidents. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez had tried to raise concerns about the pattern of elderly arrests, but her reports disappeared into administrative black holes. The few officers who spoke up found themselves assigned to graveyard shifts or the worst beats in the city. Reynolds leaned forward, pointing toward a figure emerging from a Victorian house. "Check it out. Old lady, living alone, probably loaded given the neighborhood." His predatory grin reflected in the rearview mirror. "Want to bet she gets confused about where she's going?" Davidson's stomach churned, but he remained silent. Last week, another rookie who'd objected to their methods had been found with drugs planted in his locker. The message was clear: play along or pay the price. Brennan studied the elderly woman through binoculars. Rose Thompson, according to the property records, 93 years old, former librarian. He scrolled through his tablet. No family listed locally. Perfect target. What they didn't know, what their hasty background check had failed to reveal, was that their perfect target had more backup than any of their previous victims. Their lazy research had missed the military connection that would soon turn their simple harassment into the biggest mistake of their careers. "Follow her," Brennan ordered, starting the engine. "We'll wait until she's far enough from home. Let her get tired carrying those groceries. Then we move." He glanced at Davidson in the mirror. "Today's your lucky day, rookie. You're going to learn how to boost your numbers the easy way." The patrol car pulled away from the curb, trailing Rose. At a distance, inside, the air was thick with the toxic mix of authority and desperation that had corrupted too many officers before them. They were so focused on their target that they failed to notice the growing number of cell phones recording their suspicious behavior or the concerned residents already making calls about police harassment. As they followed Rose Thompson toward Morton's grocery, None of the officers realized they were about to become an object lesson in justice. Their badges, which they'd twisted into tools of intimidation, were about to meet something far more powerful, a force of righteousness that had been forged in the crucible of actual combat, not the artificial pressure of quotas and statistics. Commander Jack Thompson stood at the window of his office at Naval Special Warfare Command, his reflection a stark reminder of the legacy he carried. At 42, his face bore the weathered marks of countless classified operations, but his eyes retained the sharp intensity that had made him legendary among his peers. The wooden frame on his desk held a faded photograph, a 12-year-old boy and his grandmother at a library opening, taken just months after he'd lost his parents. That library event had been more than just a ceremony. It was the day Rose Thompson had taught him about true strength. Power isn't about how loud you can shout, she'd told him. It's about how quietly you can make people listen. Those words had shaped his entire military career, earning him the callsign, the Arbitrator, the man who could diffuse impossible situations without firing a shot. His office walls were deliberately sparse, holding only his most significant commendations and a single quote written in his grandmother's elegant hand: "Justice doesn't require violence when wisdom will suffice." It was a philosophy he'd proven, time and again in the field, leading operations that saved lives through strategy rather than force. Today's schedule included reviewing potential recruits and analyzing recent operation reports, but his mind kept drifting to the disturbing patterns he'd noticed in his grandmother's neighborhood. Rose's weekly calls had included increasing mentions of aggressive police presence, though she'd tried to downplay her concerns. Jack had learned long ago that his grandmother's casual observations often revealed serious underlying issues. His computer screen displayed several police incident reports he'd quietly obtained through official channels. The pattern was clear. A spike in elderly arrests in Rose's precinct, most charges dismissed, but the arrests still counting toward department statistics. It was the kind of systemic abuse that made his blood boil. But Rose had taught him patience. "Gather your evidence," she'd say, "before you make your move." The emergency phone system he'd set up for Rose wasn't just about protection. It was a promise. In their family, no one stood alone. His team had often joked about his obsession with preparation, but they didn't know about the nightmares that still haunted him, arriving too late to save his parents. He'd vowed never to be too late again. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell entered his office with the day's security briefing. "Still worried about your grandmother, sir?" she asked, noting his distracted expression. Sarah was one of the few who knew about Rose. She'd experienced similar issues with her own elderly father, facing police harassment in another state. "Something's building there, Sarah. The same pattern we've seen before. Authority without accountability, power without purpose." Jack's fingers traced the edge of his desk, a habit from his sniper days when patience meant survival. "I've got contacts in Boston PD's internal affairs watching the situation, but bureaucracy moves too. Slowly sometimes." His phone buzzed, a text from one of those contacts. Pattern escalating, 3 officers showing consistent targeting behavior, multiple complaints buried. Jack's jaw tightened. He'd seen this before in conflict zones. The slow erosion of justice, the subtle shift from protection to persecution. "Sir," Sarah hesitated, "have you considered taking leave? Being closer to the situation?" She knew his response before he spoke. Jack Thompson didn't run to fights, he prepared for them. "Not yet," he replied, turning back to the window. "Rose taught me timing is everything. When she needs me, she'll call, and when she does..." He left the sentence unfinished, but Sarah understood. She'd seen that look before, usually before he solved situations that everyone else thought impossible. A knock at the door interrupted them, a junior officer with routine paperwork. As Jack signed the documents, his mind was already gaming out scenarios, preparing responses, building mental maps of his grandmother's neighborhood. His commanding officer had once said Jack had two speeds: methodical preparation and lightning. Execution. Both had been learned from Rose. The photograph on his desk caught the morning light, highlighting his grandmother's proud smile. She'd been his anchor after losing his parents, teaching him that true strength came from protecting others, not dominating them. Now, decades later, those lessons were more relevant than ever. What those officers in Boston couldn't realize, was that they weren't just following an elderly woman. They were walking into the orbit of someone who'd spent a lifetime learning how to right wrongs, not through violence, but through an unshakable commitment to justice. Jack straightened his uniform and returned to his work, knowing that when Rose's call came, and he was certain now that it would, he would be ready. Rose's arms were beginning to tire from carrying her groceries when she noticed the patrol car pulling alongside her. She'd made it halfway home, past the busy coffee shop where young professionals were spilling onto the sidewalk with their morning lattes, the weight of the paper bag pressed against her chest, fresh bread and vegetables carefully chosen just minutes ago. "Ma'am, stop right there!" Officer Brennan's voice carried the false authority of someone who'd practiced intimidation. In the mirror, he stepped out of the patrol car, followed by Reynolds and Davidson. Their boots scraped against the pavement as they surrounded her in a triangle formation. The morning crowd slowed their pace, smartphones appearing in hands like modern-day witnesses. Rose felt her heart quicken, but kept her spine straight, just as she'd done during 4 decades of facing down unruly library patrons. "Is there a problem, officers?" Her voice carried the crisp dignity that had once silenced entire reading rooms. Reynolds circled her like a shark, his badge catching the morning sun. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. Several residents complained about an elderly woman acting erratically." "The only suspicious activity I see," Rose replied, adjusting her grip on the grocery bag, "is 3 officers harassing a woman old enough to be their grandmother." A ripple of murmurs spread through the growing crowd. Davidson shifted uncomfortably, but Brennan stepped closer, invading her personal space. "Ma'am, your combative attitude is concerning. Are you aware of your current location?" "I've been walking this route every Thursday for longer than you've been alive, officer." Rose's eyes met his, unflinching. "Morton's Grocery to 247 Maple Street, my home for the past 63 years. "She seems confused," Reynolds announced loudly, playing to their imaginary audience. "Claims she lives in that fancy Victorian, but we've had reports of elderly scammers casing properties in the area." The absurdity of the accusation hung in the air. Several onlookers were now openly recording, their phones trained on the scene. Mrs. Chen had emerged from her flower shop, her face a mask of outrage. "Put down the bag, ma'am," Brennan ordered. "We need to verify your identity and residence." Rose's arms trembled, not from fear, but from the strain of holding her groceries. "My ID is in my purse, which I'll show you once I set this down properly. I don't want my eggs to break." "Drop it now!" Reynolds barked, his hand moving to his belt in an unnecessary show of force. The grocery bag slipped from Rose's grasp, hitting the sidewalk with a crash of breaking glass. Her jar of honey shattered, seeping through the paper bag like blood. The sight of her carefully selected groceries scattered across the concrete stirred something in her, not anger, but determination. "That's destruction of property," Brennan announced, as if he hadn't just caused it. "And now you're creating a public disturbance." Rose's hand moved slowly toward her handbag, where Jack's special phone rested. The officers tensed, but she kept her movements deliberate and calm. "I'm reaching for my phone, officers. I believe I'm entitled to make a call." "She's reaching!" Reynolds shouted, creating drama where there was none. His hand gripped his taser. "My grandson," Rose continued, her voice carrying across the now silent street, "would be very interested in how you're conducting yourselves." "Step away from the bag," Brennan commanded, but Rose had already pressed the single button on Jack's phone. The small device emitted a soft beep. Connection established. "You're under arrest," Reynolds declared, producing handcuffs with theatrical flourish. "Resisting officers Suspicious behavior, potential property invasion. As the cold metal touched her wrists, Rose stood with the same dignity she'd maintained through war rationing, civil rights movements, and the loss of her only son. Her voice was clear and steady as she spoke into the air, knowing Jack's phone would pick up every word. I'm being arrested on Maple Street, 1 block from Chen's Flowers. 3 officers, badge numbers visible, and grandson. They have no idea what they're doing. The crowd's phones captured everything. The excessive force, the absurd charges. The quiet strength of a 93-year-old woman who showed more composure than the officers arresting her. What those officers didn't realize as they led Rose toward their patrol car was that they'd just started a countdown. In a secure office miles away, that countdown would end with justice. Commander Jack Thompson was reviewing operation reports when the emergency alert lit up his secure phone. The distinct pattern, one he'd programmed specifically for his grandmother's panic button, instantly shifted him into operational mode. His office fell silent as Rose's voice filled the room through the speaker, every word clear and deliberate. 20 years of special operations had taught Jack to process information in microseconds. 3 officers, badge numbers visible. Maple Street location. His grandmother's controlled voice carrying undercurrents of tension. Before Rose finished speaking, he was already moving. "Sarah," he called to Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, who appeared in his doorway as if she'd been waiting. "Execute Protocol Echo 7. It was a contingency they'd rehearsed. Not because Jack was paranoid, but because he lived by the SEAL motto, the more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in war. His fingers flew across his keyboard, accessing the encrypted database. He'd built for exactly this scenario. Every police officer in his grandmother's precinct, their records, their connections, their patterns of behavior, all compiled legally through his military liaison position. In seconds, he had the likely identities of the 3 officers based on their patrol patterns and recent reports. "Car ready in 3 minutes, sir," Sarah reported, returning with his go-bag, a civilian kit prepared for domestic interventions. Boston PD Internal Affairs has been notified through secure channels. Local news stations are already picking up social media feeds of the incident. Jack switched to his civilian clothes with military precision, tailored suit that would command respect without broadcasting his military status. His credentials, both military and the special liaison badges he'd acquired through years of interagency work, went into an inside pocket. "Monitor the social feeds," he instructed Sarah. "I want every video, every witness statement. Have legal ready to move on civil rights violations." His voice was calm, measured, the same tone that had talked hostage-takers down and defused. International incidents. The phone's GPS showed his grandmother's signal moving. They were taking her to the precinct. Good. Controlled environment, witnesses, cameras. The officers had no idea they were walking into a carefully prepared battlefield. "Sir," Sarah handed him a tablet displaying live traffic patterns. "Fastest route cleared. Local assets are in position." Those assets were fellow service members, stationed nearby, not for intervention, but for observation. Jack believed in overwhelming intelligence, not overwhelming force. He checked his watch. 18 minutes since Rose's call. The officers would still be processing her, following their procedures, creating their paper trail. Every document they filed would become part of their own undoing. "Patch me through to Captain Richards at the precinct," Jack instructed, entering the waiting car. The police captain was one of his back-channel contacts, a good cop trying to clean up a troubled department. "Tell him the Arbitrator is incoming, he'll understand." The car pulled away from the Naval Special Warfare Command, its driver taking the pre-planned route they'd rehearsed monthly. Jack used the time to review the officers' files on his tablet. Brennan, Reynolds, Davidson, a pattern of escalating. Incidents, hidden complaints, buried reports. They were about to learn the difference between bullying civilians and facing someone who'd spent his life fighting real battles. "Remember," Rose's voice echoed in his memory from years ago. "True. The power isn't in making people fear you. It's in making them fear disappointing you. She taught him that after he'd gotten into a fight defending her honor at school. Now, decades later, he was about to teach that lesson to 3 officers who'd forgotten the meaning of their badges. The city blurred past his window as Jack made final preparations. His grandmother had given him a foundation of justice and integrity. The Navy SEALs had given him the skills to enforce those principles. And these officers had just given him the perfect opportunity to demonstrate why his call sign wasn't just a nickname. It was a promise. 10 minutes out, his driver reported. Jack nodded, his mind already in the precinct, mapping angles, planning moves. Not with violence, Rose had taught him better than that, but with the precise, overwhelming application of justice. These officers thought they were processing a helpless old woman. Instead, they were about to face the full weight of legitimate authority, wielded by someone who'd learned its true meaning at his grandmother's knee. The first video hit Twitter at 9:47 a.m. Filmed by a barista from the coffee shop, it showed 3 officers surrounding an elderly woman with groceries. By 9:52 a.m., it had been shared 1,000 times. By 9:55 a.m., local news stations were sliding into commenters' DMs, seeking permission to broadcast the footage. Breaking. 93-year-old woman arrested while walking home from grocery shopping in Boston. Police brutality, elder abuse, became the trending hashtag that caught fire across social platforms. Each new angle from different witnesses added fuel to the digital inferno. The clip of Rose's grocery bag crashing to the ground, honey seeping across the concrete, became an instant symbol of police overreach. Inside the Boston Police Department's communications office, media liaison officer Jennifer Martinez's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Local stations wanted statements. National networks were picking up the story. Her inbox filled with interview requests faster than she could mark them as read. "Get me everything on those officers," she barked at her assistant. "And somebody find out why the hell I'm learning about this from Twitter instead of our own people." Up in his office, police. Captain James Richards watched the social media storm unfold on multiple screens. 25 years on the force had taught him to recognize watershed moments, and this was quickly becoming one. When his secure line rang and he heard the words, "The Arbitrator is incoming," his face went pale. "Clear my schedule," he told his secretary, "and get me every piece of paper those officers have touched in the last 6 months. He knew that nickname, knew what it meant. Someone had just pulled the pin on a grenade in his precinct. At the Boston Globe, veteran reporter Michael Chen was already piecing together a pattern. "Cross-reference every elderly arrest in that precinct for the past 3 months, he told his research team. "Focus on dismissed charges, similar officers, anything that shows a pattern." His sister owned the flower shop on Maple Street. She'd called him the moment it happened. The cell phone videos kept coming. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop had captured the clearest footage of Rose's calm declaration about her grandson. Someone had isolated that clip, adding captions. "They have no idea what they're doing." It was being shared with comments like, "Watch till the end. Grandmother's warning gives me chills." Local community Facebook groups exploded with activity. Residents shared their own stories of encounters with these same officers. A pattern emerged. Elderly targets, trumped-up charges, cases mysteriously dismissed, but arrests still counting. Toward statistics. In the precinct's break room, officers gathered around TVs showing local news coverage. The younger cops shifted uncomfortably, seeing their profession's reputation take another hit. The veterans recognized something else in Rose's composed demeanor and that final warning. This wasn't going to be a typical civilian complaint. "She mentioned a grandson," Officer Sarah Kelly muttered to her partner. "Why do I feel like that's the most important detail everyone's missing?" At the local news station, WBR, producer David Patterson was assembling a special report. "Get Me background on Rose Thompson, he told his researchers. Something's not adding up. Nobody that age stays that calm during an arrest unless they know something we don't. The police union representatives were already drafting statements, trying to get ahead of the story. But their usual templates about ongoing investigations and withholding judgment felt hollow against the visual evidence spreading across the internet. Internal Affairs Detective Marcus Wong sat in his office reviewing the trending videos. He'd been building a case against these officers for months, but bureaucratic roadblocks had stalled his investigation. Now, watching Rose Thompson's arrest, from multiple angles, he allowed himself a small smile. Sometimes, he thought, justice needs a catalyst. In the digital realm, the incident was taking on a life of its own. Memes emerged. Rose's dignified stance contrasted with the officer's aggressive posturing. Her final warning became a catchphrase, overlaid on various backgrounds. But unlike typical viral moments, this one carried an undercurrent of anticipation. Something about Rose's composure, about her mention of a grandson, made viewers feel like they were watching the beginning of a story, not its end. Local community leaders began mobilizing. The Council on Aging announced an emergency meeting. Civil rights organizations issued statements. But through all the noise, a subtle thread emerged in the comments across platforms. Watch what happens next. Those who knew Rose Thompson, who'd experienced her quiet strength at the library over the decades, recognized that expression she'd worn during the arrest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was the look of someone who knew exactly what domino she'd just tipped and where all the others would fall. Captain James Richards stood at his office window, watching the growing media presence outside the precinct. 3 news vans had already claimed spots in the parking lot, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. His reflection in the glass looked older than it had that morning. "Sir," his secretary's voice crackled through the intercom, "Internal Affairs is here, and there's something else you should see." She appeared at his door, tablet in hand, her face ashen. "We ran a deeper background check on Rose Thompson's family connections." Richards took the tablet, his eyes scanning the document. With each line, his expression grew grimmer. Military liaison positions, classified operations, strategic response coordinator. The list of Commander Jack Thompson's credentials read like a thriller novel's protagonist. "Get Brennan, Reynolds, and Davidson up here now." His voice carried the weight of someone who knew they were standing on a landmine. Down in the bullpen, the atmosphere had shifted. Officers clustered in small groups, smartphones displaying endless loops of Rose's arrest. The younger cops had already started distancing themselves from the 3 officers involved, a subtle but clear indication of the department's shifting loyalties. "They're saying her grandson's some kind of military big shot," Officer Lisa Chen whispered to her partner. "Martinez in records says she's never seen credentials like his." Detective Sandra Morris, a 20-year veteran, watched the whispered conversations with growing concern. She'd warned the department about quota-based policing 6 months ago. Now, her memo, ignored then, was being frantically printed and distributed among the higher-ups. Brennan, Reynolds, and Davidson sat in the break room, their coffee growing cold. The initial bravado had evaporated, replaced by a creeping realization that they'd walked into something much bigger than a simple arrest quota. "It was by the book," Brennan muttered, more to convince himself than others. "Suspicious behavior, failure to comply." "Suspicious behavior?" Officer Kelly scoffed from the doorway. "She was carrying groceries, Mike. The only suspicious behavior was yours." She tossed a printout on their table, Rose Thompson's community service record, 40 years as head librarian, volunteer literacy coordinator, 3 mayoral citations for civic contributions. The elevator dinged, and Internal Affairs. Detective Wong stepped out, accompanied by 2 officers no one recognized. Their presence sent a ripple through the bullpen. IA didn't bring outside observers unless something major was brewing. "Captain wants you 3 upstairs," Wong announced to Brennan's group, his tone neutral but his eyes hard. "I'd suggest you start thinking very carefully about your recent arrest patterns." As they trudged toward the elevator, the department's usual solidarity was notably absent. No supportive glances, no casual words of encouragement. Even officers who'd previously turned a blind eye to their methods were suddenly absorbed in paperwork. In his office, Richards reviewed the morning's footage again. Rose Thompson's calm warning echoed in his mind. 25 years of police. Work had taught him to recognize watershed moments, and this was rapidly becoming one. His phone buzzed, a message from a contact in the mayor's office. City Hall watching situation closely. Possible civil rights investigation. Control the damage. But Richards knew it was too late for damage control. His inbox was filling with reports from other precincts, all documenting similar patterns of elderly arrests. What had seemed like isolated incidents was emerging as a systemic issue, and Rose Thompson's arrest had just ripped away the curtain. Officer Martinez poked her head in. "Sir, the press is asking for a statement, and there's a call from Naval Special Warfare Command on line 2. Richards reached for his phone, then hesitated. In his desk drawer lay a folder he'd been compiling for months. Evidence of quotas, pushing officers toward questionable arrests, reports of targeting vulnerable populations, documentation of complaints mysteriously vanishing. Perhaps it was time to make that folder public. The 3 officers finally reached his office, their earlier confidence deflated. Before they could speak, Richards held up the tablet displaying Commander Thompson's credentials. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "do you have any idea what you've done?" Through his window, he could see more media vans arriving. On his desk, phones continued to buzz with messages from City Hall, the police union, and various department heads. But it was the silent phone line from Naval Special Warfare Command that seemed to echo the loudest in the room. The department was at a crossroads, and everyone knew it. The only question was whether they'd handle this with dignity or be dragged kicking and screaming into accountability. The black SUV pulled up to the precinct exactly 20 minutes after Rose's call. No sirens, no squealing tires, just the quiet confidence of inevitable justice arriving on schedule. Commander Jack Thompson stepped out, his civilian suit doing little to hide his military bearing. The gathered media instantly recognized something was different about this arrival, cameras swinging to capture his measured stride toward the entrance. The precinct's front desk officer looked up as Jack entered, the blast of camera flashes behind him creating a momentary halo effect. "Sir, I'll need to see some ID and—" The words died in her throat as Jack silently placed his credentials on the desk. Her eyes widened as she processed the implications of the documents before her. "Page 1 is my military ID. Page 2 is my federal liaison status. Page 3... Jack's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who never needed to raise it, "is a civil rights investigation authorization." "Where is my grandmother?" The desk officer's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. "Captain Richards, you're going to want to come down here immediately." In the holding area, Rose sat perfectly composed on a bench, her posture as straight as it had been during her librarian days. She'd declined coffee, water, and every attempt by increasingly nervous officers to make her more comfortable. When she heard the subtle shift in activity from the front of the building, a small smile touched her lips. 3 minutes earlier than I expected," she murmured to herself. "He must have taken the tunnel route." Captain Richards reached the lobby just as Jack was clearing security. Their eyes met in a moment of professional recognition, 2 men who understood power and its application. Richards had seen enough military personnel to recognize the real thing and everything about. Jack Thompson screamed apex predator in civilian clothes. "Commander Thompson!" Richards extended his hand, hyper-aware of the cameras still filming through the glass doors. "We've been expecting you." "Have you?" Jack's grip was professional, but his eyes were analyzing everything. Sightlines, camera positions, personnel locations. "Then you've had time to prepare the incident reports?" body cam footage and arrest documentation for my grandmother's case. The bullpen had gone eerily quiet as Jack followed Richards through. Officers who had been busily typing moments before sat frozen, recognizing the walk of someone who had commanded men in real combat, not just street patrols. Brennan, Reynolds, and Davidson were descending the stairs from the captain's office when Jack entered the main floor. Their earlier bravado evaporated as Jack's gaze locked onto them. It wasn't an angry look. It was the calculated assessment of someone who had faced down actual threats and found these three wanting. My grandmother, Jack's voice carried across the suddenly silent room, is 73 years my senior. She taught me that respect isn't earned through force, but through wisdom. His eyes never left the three officers. Would you like to explain why you failed to demonstrate either quality this morning? Reynolds, trying to maintain some authority, stepped forward. Sir, this is a police matter. No, Jack cut him off with surgical precision. This was a police matter. Now it's a federal civil rights investigation, a military liaison inquiry, and, he gestured to the windows where cameras continued to flash, a very public demonstration of law enforcement accountability. Officer Kelly, watching from her desk, would later swear she saw the three officers physically shrink under Jack's steady gaze. It wasn't just his credentials or his obvious military background. It was the absolute certainty he projected, the kind that came from facing real life-and-death situations. Now, Jack continued, his voice carrying the same quiet strength Rose had displayed earlier, we're going to handle this professionally. You'll provide every document, every video frame, every radio transmission related to this incident and your recent arrest patterns. Then we'll discuss how to ensure this type of situation never occurs again. He turned to address the entire room. My grandmother spent 40 years teaching people to respect knowledge and truth. She believed in the power of learning from mistakes. His slight emphasis on learning carried clear implications. Let's honor that tradition, as Jack was led. To the holding area, officers scrambled to gather the requested materials. The three arresting officers stood rooted in place, finally understanding what Rose's warning had meant. They hadn't just arrested an elderly woman, they'd triggered a reckoning. Rose looked up as Jack entered, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared understanding. Rose looked up as Jack entered, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared understanding. No words were needed. They'd been here before, standing against injustice together. Just as she'd supported him after his parents' death, he now stood as her guardian against those who'd forgotten the meaning of their badges. You're early, she said simply. Traffic was light, he replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. Ready to go home, Rose stood, smoothing her dress with the same dignity she'd shown throughout the ordeal. Yes, but first, I believe these officers need a lesson in civil service and respect. Jack offered his arm, and as Rose took it, the watching officers witnessed something powerful, not just family loyalty or military authority, but the quiet strength of justice being properly served. The precinct's largest conference room had been hastily cleared for the meeting. Jack sat at one end of the long table, his grandmother beside him, while the three officers occupied the other end. Captain Richards and Detective Wong from internal. Affairs flanked the sides, completing the tableau. The room's tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Let's start with procedure, Jack began, his voice carrying the same calm authority he'd used in countless high-stakes negotiations. Officer Brennan, walk us through your probable cause for approaching a 93-year-old woman carrying groceries in broad daylight. Brennan shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of how the fluorescent lights made his sweat visible. We had reports of suspicious activity in the area. Documented reports? Jack interrupted smoothly, sliding a folder across the table. Because I have here every filed report from your precinct for the past 3 months. Would you like to point out which ones justified your actions? The folder sat unopened, a silent accusation. Reynolds attempted to jump in, his voice carrying a defensive edge. Sir, we were responding to patterns, Jack echoed, the word hanging in the air like a sword. Let's discuss patterns, Officer Reynolds. He produced another folder. Your arrest record shows an interesting one. 37. Elderly arrests in 3 months. All charges dismissed. All arrests counted toward your quota. Rose sat quietly beside her grandson, her presence a reminder of why they were all there. She watched the officer's body language with the same analytical eye she'd used to spot troubled teens in her library. The slight shifts, the avoiding gazes, the nervous adjustments of collars. We were following department protocol, Davidson offered weakly. Jack's response was surgical. Were you? Because I have here. Another folder appeared as if by magic, the actual department protocols regarding civilian engagement. Shall we compare them to your body cam footage? The young officer's face paled. Jack had laid his trap perfectly. Every document, every statistic, every piece of evidence arranged to dismantle their defenses methodically. Commander Thompson, Captain Richards interjected. What exactly are you seeking here? Jack leaned forward slightly, his presence filling the room without any physical movement. Justice, Captain, but more importantly, change. He turned his attention back to the officers. You've been operating in an echo chamber where this behavior seemed acceptable. That ends today. He pressed a button on his phone, and the room's screen came to life with social media feeds. Dozens of videos showing their pattern of elderly targeting played simultaneously. Your actions haven't just violated department policy or civil rights. You've betrayed public trust. Reynolds, still trying to maintain some control, straightened in his chair. With all due respect, sir. Respect? Rose spoke for the first time, her voice carrying decades of librarian authority. You don't get to speak about respect after what I witnessed today, not just toward me, but toward every elderly person you've targeted. Jack allowed her words to settle before continuing. Here's what happens next. You're going to sign full statements, admitting to your pattern of behavior. You're going to cooperate fully with internal affairs, and you're going to enroll in a community service program at the senior center, not as officers, but as students. And if we refuse? Brennan's question came out barely above a whisper. Jack's smile didn't reach his eyes. Then I release everything, every report, every video, every statistic, to the 7 news networks waiting outside. Your choice, accountability or public crucifixion. The room fell silent as the options sank in. Detective Wong watched, with professional admiration, as Jack systematically dismantled months of ingrained behavior in minutes. You have 5 minutes to decide, Jack concluded, standing. Grandmother, would you like some tea while we wait? Rose rose with characteristic grace. That would be lovely. Perhaps these officers could use the time to reflect on why they chose to protect and serve in the first place. As they stepped out, leaving the 3 officers to stew, Captain Richards followed them. Commander, that was impressive. No, Captain, Jack corrected quietly. That was necessary. Real authority doesn't come from intimidation. It comes from accountability. He glanced at his grandmother, who nodded in approval. They forgot that. Today, they remember. Back in the conference room, the 3 officers stared at the blank statement forms before them. They had just experienced something none of their police training had prepared them for, the difference between wielding power and facing true authority. Detective Marcus Wong's office transformed into a war room within minutes of Jack's arrival. Screens displayed body camera footage, arrest records, and social media feeds. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, who had arrived shortly after Jack, efficiently organized the digital evidence while Wong spread physical documents across his desk. Their pattern was consistent, Wong explained, pulling up a heat map of elderly arrests. Every Thursday and Sunday morning, primarily in areas where seniors would be running errands. They knew the routines, the vulnerabilities. Jack stood before the largest screen, watching footage from previous arrests. His trained eye caught the subtle intimidation tactics, the triangular formation around elderly targets, the aggressive stance, the calculated confusion of rapid-fire questions. Cross-reference these incidents with dismissed cases, he instructed, his fingers moving across a tablet. I want to see every charge they filed that didn't stick. The data painted a damning picture. 37 elderly arrests over 3 months, each following the same playbook. Charges ranging from suspicious behavior to failure to comply. All dismissed, but all counting toward department quotas. Here's where it gets interesting, Sarah noted, pulling up personnel files. After each cluster of arrests, their performance reviews improved. Commendations for proactive policing and community engagement. Rose, who had insisted on being part of the evidence review, sat in a corner chair analyzing arrest reports with a librarian's attention to detail. The language is nearly identical in each report, she observed, almost as if they were working from a template. Jack moved to her side, examining the reports she'd flagged. They were. Look at the time-stamp patterns. He pointed to a series of digital signatures. Reports filed within minutes of each other, using the same phraseology. They were copy-pasting justifications. Wong's eyes narrowed as he recognized the implications. That's not just lazy policing, that's deliberate falsification of police records. The evidence mounted methodically. Sarah pulled up GPS data from patrol vehicles, showing deliberate circling of senior centers, grocery stores, and community gathering spots. Body camera footage revealed a pattern of aggressive escalation, turning routine encounters into arrestable offenses. Their biggest mistake wasn't arresting me, Rose commented, studying a particularly troubling video. It was assuming all their previous victims were powerless. Jack nodded, understanding what she meant. Each folder contained complaints that had been filed but never processed, witnesses who had tried to speak up but were ignored. A systemic failure that went beyond 3 officers. Here's their financial records, Sarah announced, bringing up new data. Each quota-based bonus coincides with a spike in elderly arrests. The room fell silent as a particularly disturbing piece of body cam footage played. An 85-year-old man being confronted for suspicious behavior while feeding pigeons. The officer's tactics were textbook intimidation, designed to provoke confusion and fear. "Stop there," Jack commanded. He stepped closer to the screen, focusing on a detail in the background. Enhancement on the top right corner. The image zoomed in, revealing a security camera mounted on a nearby building. "Get me that footage," he ordered. "And check every arrest location for additional security cameras. These body cams only show their perspective. I want independent views." Wong was already making calls, his network of contacts expanding the investigation's reach. Within hours, external video footage began flowing in, providing unbiased perspectives of the officers' tactics. Rose methodically catalogued each piece of evidence, creating a timeline that showed the escalation of their behavior. They grew bolder with each successful arrest, she noted. Each dismissed charge only encouraged more aggressive tactics. The evidence painted a picture of systemic abuse hidden behind bureaucratic procedures. Performance metrics had been weaponized, turning vulnerable citizens into statistics. "One more thing," Sarah said, pulling up department emails. "Look at the communication pattern between these officers and their supervisors." She highlighted a series of messages showing not just awareness of their tactics, but subtle encouragement. Jack studied the email chain, his expression hardening. "This goes beyond 3 officers. The whole system needs restructuring." He turned to Wong. "How high up does your authority reach?" The detective's smile was grim. "With this evidence, as high as we need it to." Rose closed the last folder, her librarian's precision evident in the organized stacks before her. "In my experience," she said quietly, "real change only happens when you pull weeds out by the roots." Jack nodded, understanding perfectly. They hadn't just gathered evidence against 3 officers, they documented the failure of an entire system. Now came the part he did best, using that evidence to force fundamental change. "Prepare it. All for presentation," he instructed. "Tomorrow we show them exactly what they've been enabling." His voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who had faced bigger battles. Sometimes, the only way to fix a broken system is to expose every crack. Detective Marcus Wong had spent 15 years in internal affairs watching good investigations die in bureaucratic quicksand. But as he stood before the police commissioner's board with Commander Thompson beside him, he knew this time would be different. The evidence they'd compiled wasn't just comprehensive, it was bulletproof. "This isn't just about 3 officers," Wong began, his laser pointer highlighting key statistics on the projection screen. "What we've uncovered is a systemic failure of oversight and accountability." The board members shifted uncomfortably as their own email exchanges appeared on screen. Jack stood silently, his presence adding weight to every revelation. The commissioner, a veteran of department politics, recognized the storm brewing before them. This wasn't going to be contained with the usual administrative shuffle. "Our investigation reveals a direct correlation between quota-based performance reviews and targeted harassment of vulnerable populations," Wong continued. "Specifically, a 312% increase in elderly arrests over the past quarter, with a 97% dismissal rate." Sarah Mitchell, coordinating remotely from her military liaison position, fed new data to the presentation screens. Financial records, performance reviews, internal memos, each document adding another layer to the picture of institutional failure. But perhaps most disturbing, Wong clicked to the next slide, is the pattern of buried complaints. The screen, filled with dozens of faces, elderly citizens who had filed reports only to have them vanish into administrative void. Each of these individuals attempted to report abuse of authority. Each complaint was systematically ignored. The commissioner leaned forward. "Detective Wong, what exactly are you proposing?" "Not proposing, sir. Implementing." Wong's voice carried new authority. "As of this morning, the Department of Justice has opened a formal investigation into our complaint processing procedures. Commander Thompson's evidence has triggered federal oversight." The room erupted in murmured conversations. Federal oversight meant no more internal handling, no more quiet reassignments. The board members' faces reflected the dawning realization that their own actions would face scrutiny. "We've already begun deploying new oversight protocols," Jack spoke for the first time, his quiet voice cutting through the chaos. "Every arrest will be reviewed by an independent civilian board. Body camera footage will be automatically archived to secure external servers. Complaint processing will be handled by a third-party agency." One board member, his face flushed, stood up. "This is an overreach. You can't just come in here and—" "Actually, we can." Wong pulled up the next document. "Federal authorization for a complete departmental audit. Your choices are simple: cooperate with reform or face individual liability for obstruction." The commissioner, recognizing the inevitable, raised his hand for silence. "What's our next step?" Jack stepped forward, laying out 3 folders. First, immediate suspension of all quota-based performance metrics. Second, establishment of a civilian oversight committee with priority given to representatives from vulnerable communities. Third, mandatory retraining for all officers, focusing on de-escalation and community engagement. Wong watched his superior's reactions with contained satisfaction. In 15 years, he'd never seen the board so quiet, so attentive. Fear of public exposure was accomplishing what moral arguments never had. "One more thing," Jack added, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Every officer involved in elderly arrests over the past 6 months will personally apologize to their victims, not through letters or representatives, face to face." The commissioner nodded slowly, understanding that resistance was futile. The combination of federal authority, public outrage, and irrefutable evidence had created perfect storm of accountability. As the meeting concluded, Wong gathered his materials, catching Jack's eye. They both knew this was just the beginning. Real change would require constant vigilance, persistent pressure, and unwavering commitment to reform. Outside the boardroom, Rose waited with Sarah, who had coordinated the entire presentation remotely. "How did they take it?" Rose asked, though the grim faces of exiting board members told her plenty. "Like medicine," Jack replied. "Bitter, but necessary." He turned to Wong. "Your team has full authority to implement changes. Any resistance will be documented and added to the federal investigation," Wong finished. He'd waited 15 years for this moment. The chance to really clean house. "We won't waste this opportunity." The precinct would never be the same after today. As news of the federal investigation spread through the ranks, officers would have to choose, adapt to real accountability, or find another line of work. For Wong, watching decades of entrenched corruption finally face justice, it felt like a new dawn in law enforcement. The breakthrough came at 2 a.m. when Sarah Mitchell was cross-referencing Rose's address with historical police data. Her phone call jolted Jack awake in his hotel room. "Sir, you need to see this." Sarah's voice carried an urgency he hadn't heard. Since their last combat operation, Rose wasn't random. She was targeted specifically, and it goes back way further than we thought. Within 30 minutes, Jack stood in Wong's office, staring at a complex web of connections displayed across multiple screens. Rose's address appeared at the center, surrounded by a pattern that made his blood run cold. "Every elderly arrest in the past 3 months," Sarah explained, highlighting points on the map, "forms a perfect circle around your grandmother's neighborhood. They were working their way inward, testing responses, learning patterns." Wong pulled up property records, dating back 20 years. "Look at this. Every arrested senior lived in a historic home, owned outright, no mortgages." His fingers flew across the keyboard, bringing up more documents. "And here's where it gets interesting. Within 6 months of each arrest, those properties were sold at below-market rates to shell companies. Real estate acquisition through intimidation," Jack muttered, the pieces falling into place. "Force elderly residents out, buy properties cheap, flip them for development." His jaw tightened as he turned to another screen. But why target Rose specifically? Rose herself provided the answer when they called her in. Looking at the property records, she adjusted her glasses with the precision of someone used to finding patterns in chaos. "The library archives," she said quietly. "I've been digitizing them for the Historical Society, including records of original property deeds and historical landmark designations." Sarah's fingers raced across her keyboard. "She's right. The library's digital archives would prove these properties should be protected under historical preservation laws. Development would be impossible without destroying the records." Jack finished, his voice hard. "They weren't just harassing elderly residents. They were trying to eliminate evidence of historical property protections." Wong pulled up personnel files of high-ranking officers. "It goes higher. Look at these investment records. Captain Stevens, Deputy Commissioner Phillips, they're all invested in the same development company, Meridian Properties. The screens filled with financial data, showing millions flowing through elaborate networks of shell companies. Each connected back to Meridian Properties, and each tied to neighborhoods where elderly residents had faced police harassment. The 3 officers who arrested Rose," Sarah highlighted their financial records, "received regular payments through offshore accounts. Small amounts, easily missed unless you knew to look for them." Rose studied the pattern of arrests overlaid on the property map. "They were methodical," she observed. Each arrest served 2 purposes, padding their statistics while pressuring homeowners to sell. "But they made one crucial mistake," Jack said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "They thought you were just another elderly target. They didn't realize you'd spent 40 years teaching people how to protect historical records." Wong's phone buzzed, more data arriving from his network of informants. "It's bigger than just Boston. Meridian Properties has similar patterns in 3 other cities, always the same approach. Corrupt officers, elderly homeowners, historic neighborhoods." No wonder they pushed so hard for quota-based arrests, Sarah added. It gave their officers perfect cover for systematic harassment. Who would question increased arrest numbers when the department demanded them? Jack stood before the evidence wall, his military training kicking in. This wasn't just corruption. It was a strategic operation using police power for private gain. How many properties have they acquired so far? Sarah pulled up the data. 43 in Boston alone. Combined value after rezoning and development. She paused, double-checking the numbers. Just over 100 million. And my grandmother's house? Jack asked, though he already suspected the answer. The Keystone, Wong confirmed. Her property connects 4 historic districts. Without those original property records she's been digitizing, there'd be no way to prove the preservation requirements. They needed her archives destroyed and her property acquired to unlock the entire development plan. Rose adjusted her pearls, a gesture Jack recognized from his childhood. She was angry, but focused. Well, she said with librarian clarity, they certainly went about it the wrong way. Jack looked at the web of corruption displayed before them, his tactical mind already forming a response plan. Sarah, get me everything on Meridian properties. Wong, we need warrants for every officer involved in property acquisitions, and someone wake up the FBI's real estate fraud division. They'll want to see this. Should we alert the 3 officers? Who arrested Rose? Sarah asked, her hand hovering over her phone. No, Jack replied, his voice cold. Let them sweat. Tomorrow, they learn the difference between facing a federal investigation and being at the center of a criminal conspiracy. Rose stood by the evidence wall, her trained librarian's eye taking in the complex pattern of corruption. You know, what this reminds me of, she said suddenly. The card catalog system, everything connected, cross-referenced, leading to larger volumes of information. She smiled grimly. They never did understand the power of good record-keeping. As the sun began to rise over Boston, the true scope of what they'd uncovered was still sinking in. What had started as a case of police harassment had just exploded into something far bigger, a conspiracy that had used law enforcement as muscle for a massive real estate fraud scheme. And at the center of it all, they'd made the mistake of targeting a librarian who'd spent her life protecting historical records, never knowing her grandson was exactly the person equipped to bring their entire operation crashing down. By dawn, Jack had transformed Wong's office into a tactical command center. 3 laptops displayed different aspects of the operation, while Sarah coordinated with federal agencies via secure link. The wall-mounted screens showed surveillance, feeds of key locations, including the homes of every officer involved in the conspiracy. Timing is everything, Jack explained, standing before a digital map of Boston. We move too fast. They destroy evidence. Too slow. They relocate assets. His finger traced the pattern of property acquisitions. We need simultaneous raids on multiple locations. Wong entered with coffee and fresh intel. FBI's real estate fraud division is on board. They've been building a case against Meridian. Properties for months, but couldn't crack the police connection. Perfect, Jack nodded, pulling up personnel files. Sarah, what's our team status? Sarah's fingers flew across her keyboard. We've got 12 FBI agents en route, 7 Treasury Department investigators for the financial angle, and 4 cybersecurity experts to lock down digital evidence. Local news has been quietly tipped about major law enforcement operations, scheduled for tomorrow. Rose sat in the corner, methodically organizing property records. The library's digital archives are secured, she reported. I've sent copies to 3 separate historical societies and the National Archives. Even if they somehow access the local system, the records are safe. Jack allowed himself a small smile. His grandmother's meticulous nature had helped build an ironclad case. Wong, what about the 3 officers who arrested Rose? Still at the station, finishing their shift. They're nervous, making mistakes. Reynolds tried accessing old arrest records, but triggered our new security protocols. Every keystroke is being logged. Good. Jack turned to a new screen showing financial data. Here's how we'll play it. Phase 1. Treasury freezes all Meridian Properties assets at exactly 9 a.m. Phase 2. FBI raids their offices while we move. On the corrupt officers. Phase 3. Press conference with full evidence disclosure. Sarah looked up from her computer. Sir, I've got something else. Meridian's trying to move money offshore. Large transfers initiated in the last hour. Let them. Jack's voice carried the confidence of someone who'd anticipated this move. Treasury's already flagged those accounts. Every transfer attempt creates new evidence. Wong's phone buzzed with updates from his surveillance teams. Captain Stevens just called an emergency meeting for senior officers, scheduled for 8 a.m. Perfect timing, Jack noted. They'll all be in one place when we move. Sarah, make sure the FBI has the meeting room's blueprint. I want every exit covered. Rose looked up from her records. Jack, what about the other elderly residents? The ones who were forced to sell? Already handled, Grandma. He pulled up a new document. The FBI's asset recovery team will trace every property transaction. Original owners will have right of first refusal to repurchase at their sale price. The room hummed with purposeful activity as more data flowed in. Jack moved between screens, adjusting plans, coordinating teams, ensuring every angle was covered. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about systematic dismantling of corruption. One more thing, he announced, drawing everyone's attention. At 8:30, I want those 3 officers who arrested Rose brought to the conference room. They get one chance to cooperate before everything breaks loose. Sarah understood immediately. Psychological pressure. Let them see the operation assembling, but not know their role in it. Exactly. Jack checked his watch. They spent months intimidating elderly citizens. Let's see how they handle real pressure. The pieces were falling into place. Federal agents were taking positions across the city. News vans were quietly assembling, though they didn't yet know why. And in offices across Boston, corrupt officers were about to learn the consequences of targeting a librarian with a Navy SEAL for a grandson. Rose watched the operation unfold with quiet satisfaction. You know, Jack, she mused, in the library, we had a saying, every book has its reader. I suppose every crime has its investigator. Jack squeezed her shoulder gently. And every conspiracy has its breaking point. By this time tomorrow, Boston's law enforcement will have a very different understanding of accountability. The sun rose higher over the city as the team made final preparations. In a few hours, years of corruption would be exposed, careers would end, and justice would be served. But first, 3 very nervous officers would learn exactly why targeting Rose Thompson had been the biggest mistake of their lives. At 8:29 a.m., the precinct's main conference room crackled with tension. Captain Stevens sat at the head of the table surrounded by his senior officers, all of them unaware that federal agents had already taken positions throughout the building. Brennan, Reynolds, and Davidson shifted nervously in their chairs, isolated at the far end of the table. Jack stood by the window, his reflection a dark silhouette against the morning sun. Behind him, downtown Boston was waking up to what would become a historic day in law enforcement. Sarah monitored her laptop, silently tracking the Treasury Department's preparations to freeze Meridian's assets. Let's cut to the chase, Stevens began, his voice carrying forced confidence. These accusations against our officers are not accusations, Jack interrupted smoothly, turning from the window. Evidence. He pressed a button, and the room's screens lit up with financial records, property transfers, and surveillance footage. Would you like to explain why senior officers are receiving payments from shell companies linked to Meridian Properties? Stevens' face tightened. You're overstepping, Commander. This is a police matter. No. Jack's voice cut through the room like a blade. This stopped being a police matter when you turned law enforcement into a private security force for real estate fraud. He nodded to Sarah, who activated new displays showing the pattern of elderly arrests and property acquisitions. Reynolds, watching the evidence mount, cracked first. "We were just following orders. The arrest quotas—" "Shut up," Stevens snapped, but it was too late. Jack's smile was predatory. "Please continue, Officer Reynolds. Tell us about those quotas. Specifically, how they targeted elderly homeowners in historic districts." The room erupted in confused murmurs as more evidence appeared on screen. Property maps, financial transfers, email chains. A conspiracy laid bare in digital clarity. Some officers pushed back from the table, physically distancing themselves from their superiors. "This is what's going to happen," Jack announced, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded elite teams in combat zones. "In exactly 1 minute, Treasury will freeze all Meridian assets. In 2 minutes, FBI teams will enter their offices. And in 3 minutes—" He paused, letting the tension build. "Everyone in this room will decide which side of history they're on." Stevens stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. "You can't—" "Already done." Sarah turned her laptop, showing live feeds of FBI teams taking position. "Your offshore accounts are locked. Meridian's executives are being arrested as we speak. And those property records you tried to suppress," she smiled, "secured in multiple federal databases." The 3 officers who'd arrested Rose watched in horror as their small act of harassment transformed into evidence of a massive criminal conspiracy. Davidson, the youngest, broke ranks first. "I want to cooperate," he blurted. "I'll tell you everything about the targeting system, the property pressure tactics, all of it." Stevens lunged for the door, but found his path blocked by Wong and 2 FBI agents who'd entered silently during the presentation. The captain's face transformed from authority to desperation in seconds. "You don't understand." Stevens tried one last time. "The development deals would have revitalized—" "Save it for your arraignment," Jack cut him off. He turned to address the room at large. "Every officer here has a choice. Cooperate now, tell us everything you know, and you might salvage something from this. Resist." He let the alternatives hang in the air. The room transformed into a scene of organized chaos. Some officers immediately stepped forward to cooperate. Others sat frozen, careers and freedom evaporating before their eyes. Stevens and his inner circle were efficiently secured by federal agents. Brennan and Reynolds, watching their world collapse, finally understood the full scope of what their casual harassment of an elderly librarian had unleashed. They weren't just facing departmental discipline anymore. They were looking at federal conspiracy charges. "Time's up," Jack announced, checking his watch. "Sarah, initiate Phase 3. Outside, news vans' satellite dishes raised in unison as the story broke. Inside, FBI evidence teams swept through offices, securing documents and hard drives. The precinct's front desk was flooded with calls as the public learned the true scope of corruption in their police department. And somewhere in the building, Rose Thompson sat quietly organizing evidence files, her librarian's precision helping to ensure that not a single detail of the conspiracy would escape documentation. The officers who'd thought her an easy target were learning too late that they'd actually picked the thread that would unravel their entire criminal enterprise. The press conference room at Boston Police Headquarters had never been so packed. Every major network had cameras rolling as District Attorney Elena Martinez stepped to the podium, flanked by FBI officials, Jack Thompson, and Rose herself. Behind them, a screen displayed the staggering statistics of the corruption case. "Today marks a turning point in Boston law enforcement," Martinez began, her voice steady. "What began as a single incident of police misconduct has exposed one of the largest corruption schemes in our city's history. 32 officers have been arrested. Meridian Properties assets, valued at over $100 million, have been frozen. And most importantly, justice is being restored to our elderly citizens who were targeted by this conspiracy." Jack stood at parade rest, his presence a reminder of how one phone call had triggered an avalanche of accountability. In the front row, Detective Wong watched with satisfaction as years of buried corruption finally saw daylight. The investigation revealed a systematic effort to use police power for private gain, Martinez continued. Officers were incentivized to harass elderly homeowners in historic districts, pressuring them to sell properties below market value. These properties were then acquired by shell companies linked to Meridian Properties and corrupt police officials. The screen behind her showed a map of affected properties, each one representing a senior citizen who'd been intimidated into selling their home. But now, each point of light also represented a chance for justice. As of this morning, the FBI's asset recovery team has begun the process of returning properties to their original owners, Martinez announced. Those who were forced to sell will have the opportunity to repurchase their homes at their original sale price, with moving costs covered by seized assets from Meridian Properties. In the audience, Mrs. Chen from the flower shop wiped tears from her eyes. Her brother's property had been one of the first targeted. Now she held paperwork that would allow him to return home. Furthermore, Martinez's voice hardened, every officer involved in this conspiracy will face federal charges, those who cooperated early. She paused, glancing at Officer Davidson, who'd turned state's evidence, will have their cooperation noted in sentencing recommendations. The screen shifted to show Captain Stevens and his co-conspirators being led out of the precinct in handcuffs. The image was powerful, the same walk of shame they'd forced so many innocent seniors to endure. Rose stepped to the podium next, her voice carrying the weight of both victim and victor. What happened to me was unfortunate, but it led to uncovering a greater injustice. My years as a librarian taught me that information, properly preserved and presented, is the strongest weapon against corruption. Today, that lesson holds true. The room burst into applause. Here was a 93-year-old woman who'd not only stood up to police harassment, but had helped expose a criminal enterprise. She'd become a symbol of resistance against abuse of power. Jack took his turn at the podium, his military bearing adding gravity to his words. Moving forward, this department will implement comprehensive reforms. Every arrest will be reviewed by a civilian oversight board. Body camera footage will be automatically archived to secure independent servers. And most importantly, quota-based policing will be permanently banned. Detective Wong stepped forward with a thick binder. We're also announcing the creation of the Senior Citizens Protection Unit, specifically tasked with preventing exploitation of elderly residents. Every officer in this unit will undergo extensive community engagement training. In the back of the room, Brennan and Reynolds watched on a holding cell monitor as their careers and freedom crumbled. Their simple plan to pad arrest statistics had led to the exposure of their entire corrupt network. Officer Davidson, having chosen cooperation, sat with federal prosecutors, continuing to detail the conspiracy's inner workings. Martinez concluded the conference with an announcement that sent ripples through the law enforcement community. This investigation has expanded to 3 other cities where Meridian Properties operated similar schemes. Federal task forces are being deployed to each location. This is not the end. It's the beginning of a nationwide cleanup of corrupt police practices. As cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, Rose stood quietly beside her grandson, her hand resting on his arm. They'd done more than expose corruption. They'd created a template for fighting it. Her skills as a librarian, combined with his tactical expertise, had proven an unbeatable combination. The press conference ended, but its impact was just beginning. Across Boston, corrupt officers were turning themselves in, hoping to cut deals. Meridian Properties executives were racing to cooperate with federal prosecutors. And in historic neighborhoods throughout the city, elderly residents were receiving calls about reclaiming their homes. Justice, like the library books Rose had managed for 40 years, was finally being returned to its rightful place. 6 months after the arrests that shook Boston's law enforcement community, the changes were visible throughout the city. The historic Victorian houses that had been targeted now displayed plaques commemorating what the media had dubbed the Thompson Resolution, a reminder that justice could prevail against systematic corruption. Inside the newly reformed precinct, Officer Sarah Kelly led a training session for the Senior Citizens Protection Unit. The wall behind her displayed the unit's motto, "Protect, Respect, Serve." Behind the officers in training sat several elderly community members, including Rose Thompson, now serving as civilian advisors. The Thompson case didn't just expose corruption, Kelly explained to her trainees. It revolutionized how we approach community policing. She gestured to the new monitoring systems installed throughout the precinct, transparent walls, public access terminals showing real-time arrest data, civilian oversight panels reviewing body camera footage. In his federal custody cell, former Captain Stevens watched a news report about the nationwide impact of his scheme's exposure. Similar investigations had uncovered corrupt property schemes in Chicago, Philadelphia, and San Francisco. The Thompson Protocol, the investigative method Jack had developed, was becoming standard procedure for police corruption cases. Detective Wong, now heading internal affairs, sat in his office reviewing the latest community feedback reports. Civilian complaints had dropped by 78% since the reforms began. The wall of his office displayed framed evidence from the Thompson case, a reminder of how one act of courage could trigger systemic change. "It's not just about numbers," he explained to a visiting police commissioner from another city. "It's about rebuilding trust." Every officer now undergoes monthly community engagement evaluations. Their performance metrics focus on positive community interaction, not arrest quotas. At the senior center where it all began, Rose led a weekly Know Your Rights seminar for elderly residents. The room was always packed, not with fear, but with empowerment. Today's topic: how to use smartphone cameras to document interactions with authority figures. "Knowledge is power," Rose reminded her audience, her librarian's passion for information sharing stronger than ever. "But knowledge with action is justice." Behind her, a screen showed live feeds from police body cameras, a new transparency initiative she'd helped design. Former Officer Davidson, having served as a key witness, worked with the FBI's Police Reform Unit, traveling to departments nationwide to share his cautionary tale. His testimony had helped convict Stevens and the Meridian Properties executives, but more importantly, it had provided a blueprint for identifying similar schemes elsewhere. In the historic neighborhoods, property values had stabilized. The community had transformed their trauma into strength. Weekly neighborhood watch meetings now included police officers as participants rather than adversaries. Mrs. Chen's flower shop had become an unofficial community center where residents and officers alike stopped for coffee and conversation. Jack, back at his Naval Special Warfare Command post, had created a new civil rights response protocol based on the Boston operation. Military precision combined with civilian oversight, a model that was reshaping how authorities approached systematic corruption. The Thompson case wasn't just about catching bad cops, he explained to a class of federal investigators. It was about changing the ecosystem that allowed corruption to flourish. His presentation showed how transparent systems, community engagement, and proper oversight could prevent future abuse. The three officers who'd arrested Rose faced different fates. Reynolds and Brennan received federal sentences for their roles. In the conspiracy, Davidson, having cooperated immediately, worked under supervision in police reform programs, sharing his first-hand experience of how quota systems corrupted police work. The precinct's new captain, an African-American woman with a background in community relations, had transformed the department's culture. Officers now competed for community service awards rather than arrest numbers. Monthly town halls allowed citizens to voice concerns directly to department leadership. In the evidence room, now managed with library-style precision inspired by Rose's methods, every piece of documentation from the Thompson case was preserved. It had become required study material for police cadets nationwide, a case study in how corruption grows and how it can be defeated. The ripple effects continued spreading. Other cities adopted the Thompson Protocol's transparency requirements. Police unions across the country revised their policies on quota systems and property-related arrests. Law enforcement training academies added mandatory courses on elderly citizen rights and community engagement. But perhaps the most significant change was visible in the daily interactions between officers and elderly residents. The fear had been replaced by mutual respect. Officers helped seniors with groceries, checked on their well-being, became part of the community fabric rather than its adversaries. As Rose often said, while watching new recruits train under the reform system, sometimes it takes a small act of resistance to expose a large truth. Her simple refusal to be intimidated had triggered a transformation that would protect vulnerable citizens for generations to come. 1 year to the day after her arrest, Rose Thompson stood on the steps of her Victorian home, surrounded by a community transformed. Her weekly neighborhood gatherings had evolved from simple grocery trips into celebrations of civic engagement. Today, elderly residents walked the streets with confidence, young officers patrolled with respect, and the shadow of corruption had been replaced by the light of accountability. Who would have thought, she mused to Jack, who had flown in for the anniversary, that my Thursday shopping routine would lead to all this? She gestured to the street, where Mrs. Chen was arranging flowers for the celebration, and former Officer Davidson was helping an elderly man with his groceries, part of his ongoing community service. The Thompson case, as it had come to be, known in law enforcement circles, had become more than just a corruption bust. It had created a new model for community policing, one that prioritized protection over persecution, respect over statistics. Jack's military precision combined with Rose's librarian's wisdom had proven an unbeatable force for change. "You taught me well, Grandma," Jack smiled, watching a group of police cadets helping to set up chairs for the community gathering. Real authority comes from respect, not fear. His methods had been adopted by police departments nationwide, creating a legacy of accountability that would outlast them both. Inside Rose's home, the walls now displayed photographs chronicling the year's transformation. Images of arrested officers shared space with pictures of community celebrations, reform victories, and reunited neighbors. Her dining room table, once a simple place for tea, had become a meeting point for community leaders and police reformers. The celebration that afternoon wasn't just about remembering past injustice. It was about celebrating ongoing change. Detective Wong presented Rose with a civilian commendation for her role in reforming the department. Mrs. Chen announced the creation of a community garden dedicated to police community partnerships. Even some of the reformed officers who had turned state's evidence attended, their presence a testament to the power of redemption. As Rose looked out over her beloved neighborhood, she saw more than just physical changes. She saw elderly residents walking without fear, officers engaged in genuine community service, and a system of accountability that would protect future generations. Her grandson's military expertise had exposed the corruption, but it was her lifetime of quiet strength that had shown everyone a better way forward. "Remember what you always told me?" Jack asked as they watched the sun set over their changed community. "Every book has its reader, and every story has its purpose," Rose finished, squeezing his hand. They had written a new chapter in law enforcement history, one that would be studied and replicated for years to come. But more importantly, they had shown that even the smallest act of resistance backed by truth and justice could change an entire system. The Victorian house on Maple Street stood as it had for generations, but now it represented something new, a beacon of hope, a symbol of justice, and a reminder that true authority comes not from force, but from the courage to stand up for what's right.